She helped a lost man, then saw his face on every screen in the city. Do you know where I was going? Nora Ellis looked up from her sketchbook and found herself staring at the person who'd interrupted her quiet moment. The question hung in the air, unexpected and curious. A man in a ruined tuxedo stood under the flickering lights of the subway station. Rain was dripping from his hair and blood had dried near his temple. His eyes were fixed on the map as if New York had become a city written in another language. Nora should have walked away. New York taught girls like her not to rescue strange men after midnight. But then he whispered, I was supposed to say goodbye to someone. His name, he thought, was Adrian. That was all he remembered. Not the penthouse waiting for him, or the powerful father searching for him. Not even the famous fiancée he was supposed to marry the next morning. So Nora took him to her tiny art studio above a laundromat in Queens. She gave him an old blanket and told herself he was only a lost man who needed one night of help. Then morning came. His face appeared on every screen in Times Square. Missing, Adrian Vale, architect, here, groomed to be. The whole city was looking for him. Was crying on television, and his father was offering a reward. And Adrian was staring at Nora's unfinished painting of a bridge in the rain. He was whispering her name like he'd loved her before he ever remembered who he was. Now Nora has to decide what hurts more, helping him remember the life he belongs to, or discovering she was never a stranger in it. Do you know where I was going? Nora Ellis looked up from the strap of her canvas bag. The 59th Street subway station was almost empty at that hour, washed in the tired yellow glow of fluorescent lights. A train had passed 5 minutes earlier, leaving behind only a warm metallic wind and a few old newspapers trembling along the platform. The distant sound of water was dripping somewhere in the tunnel. Nora had just finished packing her sketch pencils. All night she'd drawn tourists, couples, and drunk college kids. She even drew one elderly man who'd asked her to make him look less divorced. Her back hurt and her fingers were stained with charcoal. She'd made exactly $87, not counting the Canadian coins someone had dropped into her case like a joke. She wanted the last Queens-bound train, a hot shower, and 6 hours of sleep before she had to paint a mural at a cafe in Brooklyn. Instead, she found a man staring at the subway map as if it were written in code. He wore a black tuxedo that probably cost more than her rent. The bow tie hung loose around his neck. His white shirt was soaked through from rain, clinging to him in cold, uneven patches. One sleeve was torn near the cuff and his hand was scraped raw across the knuckles. There was dried blood near his temple. Gasped Nora froze. New York had taught her many things. Never leave your bag open, never make eye contact with men muttering on platforms after midnight, and never mistake expensive clothes for safety. The man turned toward her. His eyes were gray, unfocused, and frightened. I think I'm supposed to be somewhere, he said. Nora tightened her grip on her bag. Then call someone. He looked down as if to find his own pockets. He searched them clumsily and pulled a phone with a shattered screen. The device was dead. No wallet, no ID. Just a torn theater ticket, a broken cufflink, and a few small pieces of glass stuck to the inside of his coat pocket. I don't know who to call, he said. Nora should have walked away. That was the sensible thing. The safe thing. The thing a woman did when she was 26 and alone underground with a bleeding stranger in a ruined tuxedo. But then he looked past her, toward the dark tunnel, and whispered, almost to himself, I was supposed to say goodbye to someone. Something in Nora's chest shifted. Not softened exactly, she wasn't that foolish, but she knew the sound of unfinished goodbyes. Her mother died during Nora's second week of filling out art school forms. There were still days when Nora reached for a sentence she'd never gotten to say. What's your name? She asked. He blinked slowly. My name. His brow tightened. I think it's Adrian, you think? I'm sorry, the apology was so automatic and so oddly polite that Nora almost believed his confusion. Almost. She stepped closer, keeping enough distance to run if she had to. Last name? He closed his eyes, trying hard. Nothing. A train announcement crackled above them, distorted and useless. Nora looked at the blood on his temple and the tremor in his hands. She saw the way he kept glancing at the stairs like part of him expected someone to appear there. You need a hospital. At the word hospital, his face changed. No, it wasn't a question. No hospitals. His breathing quickened. Please. I don't know why, but no. That terrified her more than if he'd shouted. A man with no memory who feared hospitals. A tuxedo with mud on the hem, broken glass, a dead phone, a goodbye he couldn't place. Every rational part of Nora told her to find a police officer. Instead, she heard herself say, I have a studio in Queens. You can clean up there. 1 hour. We figure out who you are. Adrian stared at her as if she'd offered him something impossible. Why would you help me? Nora slung her bag over her shoulder. I'm already regretting it. Don't ruin the moment. Who? Her studio was above a laundromat that never fully stopped smelling like detergent and burned quarters. The stairs were narrow. The radiator hissed like an angry cat, and half the ceiling leaked when it rained too hard. Miles was still awake when she unlocked the door. Her younger brother sat on the floor with sheet music spread around him, a violin case open beside his knee. At 21, Miles had the suspicious eyes of someone who'd watched his sister give away too much of herself too many times. He took one look at Adrian and stood. No. Nora shut the door behind them. Hi to you too. Nora, absolutely not. He's hurt. A stranger. A bleeding stranger in a tuxedo. That's not a person. That's the first 10 minutes of a murder documentary. Adrian, pale and dripping rainwater onto the floor, said quietly, That seems fair. Miles pointed at him. Sighs, I don't like that he agrees with me. Nora got towels from the bathroom, cleaned the cut near Adrian's temple, and wrapped his scraped hand while Miles hovered like a furious guard dog. Adrian didn't complain. He flinched only once when thunder rolled over Queens and the windows shook. Later, Nora gave him the old sofa and a blanket with paint stains on one edge. Before lying down, Adrian stopped in front of the large unfinished canvas propped against the brick wall. It was a bridge in the rain, not a famous bridge, not one tourists photographed, just a narrow pedestrian bridge from Nora's memory, painted in deep blues and silver-gray light, with one blurred figure standing beneath an old street lamp. Adrian reached toward it, then stopped before touching the wet paint. Breathe, I've seen this place, he whispered. Nora's hand tightened around the blanket. No, you haven't. He looked at her, confused. I have. You can't have. I've never shown that painting to anyone. Adrian stared at the bridge until his eyes grew heavy. Exhaustion finally pulled him down onto the sofa. Nora didn't sleep. She sat at her work table watching him breathe, telling herself she was making sure he didn't die on her couch. That was all. Then, sometime after 3, Adrian jerked awake with a strangled gasp. No, wait. He sat up, one hand clutching his chest, eyes wide with terror. Nora rushed over. Adrian, he wasn't looking at the room. He was somewhere else. Rain, he said. The bridge. A woman was said. I told her I couldn't. His breath broke. Pant, headlights, glass. I heard the car coming. Miles appeared in the bedroom doorway, pale now. Adrian pressed both hands to his head. Then he said a name. Not clearly, but unmistakably, Inhale Nora. The room went still. Nora stared at him. Her heart began to pound for reasons she couldn't name. Because she'd found him less than 3 hours ago. Because he hadn't known her name until she told him. Because the bridge in her painting belonged to a memory she'd never shared. And because the way he said her name didn't sound like he was meeting her. It sounded like he was remembering losing her. By morning, Nora had convinced herself there was a responsible way to end this. She'd take Adrian to the police. She'd explain exactly what happened. The subway station, the blood near his temple, the broken phone, the missing wallet, the nightmare, the impossible way he'd said her name. Then she'd walk away. That was the part she repeated while making coffee in her tiny kitchen, while Miles watched Adrian from across the room, like he expected the man to suddenly confess to being a jewel thief. Adrian sat at the edge of the sofa, wrapped in one of Nora's old gray hoodies. The tuxedo shirt had dried stiff on a chair. Without it, without the expensive jacket and ruined bow tie, he looked less like a mystery and more like a man who'd been dropped into the wrong life. His memory hadn't returned. He knew his first name might be Adrian. He knew the sound of violin made his chest hurt. He knew the smell of oil paint calmed him. He knew the bridge in Nora's unfinished canvas made him feel as if he'd lost something there. That was all. Miles didn't trust any of it. Nora didn't either. But when Adrian tried to thank her for the coffee and forgot the word for mug, her suspicion weakened against her will. At 10, they left for Manhattan. Rain still clung to the city, turning the sidewalks slick and reflective. Nora kept her hands in her coat pockets, walking a step ahead as if distance could keep the night before from becoming personal. Adrian followed quietly, scanning every street sign, every passing cab, every stranger's face with painful concentration. By the time they reached Times Square, the city had fully awakened. Screens flashed perfume ads, Broadway posters, and luxury watches. Celebrity faces and breaking news pulsed above the crowd. Tourists stopped in the middle of the sidewalk to take photos. Vendors shouted over the roar of traffic. A man dressed as Spider-Man argued with someone dressed as Elmo. Nora was searching for the nearest police station on her phone when the screen above them changed. A face appeared 3 stories high, Adrian's face, clean-shaven and confident, photographed in a black suit with perfect lighting and the faint smile of someone used to being watched. Beneath it, white letters cut across a blue background. Missing, Adrian Vale, architect, here, groom to be. Nora stopped so suddenly Adrian almost walked into her. Around them people began pointing. Gasp. The image shifted to news footage. A reporter stood outside a grand hotel, speaking urgently about the mysterious disappearance of Adrian Vale. He's the celebrated architect and heir to Vale Properties. He vanished only hours before his high-profile wedding to fashion heiress Celeste Monroe. Then Celeste appeared. She was beautiful in the way magazines made beauty look effortless. Pale coat, dark hair, trembling mouth, diamond ring flashing as she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. She asked Adrian to come home. She said everyone was worried. She said the wedding didn't matter, only his safety. Nora felt something cold open inside her. The man who'd slept on her paint-stained sofa wasn't some lost stranger. He belonged to penthouses, private cars, front-page headlines, and women like Celeste Monroe. Families who could make an entire city turn its face toward him. Nora saw her own reflection in a dark shop window, messy curls, worn boots, charcoal still smudged near her wrist. A girl who painted tourists for cash and lived above a laundromat, temporary. The word rose before she could stop it. Adrian stared at the screen, his face drained of color. He looked at Celeste as if she were a painting he'd been told he owned but didn't remember choosing. No recognition softened him, only confusion. Then another clip played. Richard Vale stood before reporters outside a black SUV, tall and silver-haired, his expression controlled and severe. He spoke with the authority of a man used to doors opening before he touched them. Inhale. Bring my son home before someone exploits him. Nora didn't need anyone to explain who someone might be. A reward amount appeared below Adrian's photograph. It was more money than Nora had made in the last 2 years. Her stomach turned. She grabbed Adrian's sleeve and pulled him away from the crowd before anyone could look too closely. But near the edge of the square she saw them, 3 men in dark coats moving with too much purpose, scanning faces instead of screens. Not police, too polished, too quiet, private security. One of them lifted a phone and looked directly in their direction. Adrian saw him. His body reacted before his mind did. His breath shortened. His hand clamped around Nora's wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but with raw fear. Nora'd seen fear before, real fear. It didn't look like acting. They ducked into the entrance of a subway station and moved with the morning crowd down the stairs. Nora bought him a cheap prepaid phone from a kiosk 2 blocks away, mostly because she needed him to stop using hers, partly because she needed proof she still had control over something. Inhale. The phone rang less than 10 minutes later. No one should have had the number. Adrian stared at the screen. Nora answered on speaker without speaking. A woman's voice came through, soft and trembling with practiced tenderness. Celeste. She told Adrian he was confused. She told him he'd hit his head. She told him his father only wanted him safe. Her voice was beautiful, intimate, almost convincing. Then she said she knew his hand must still hurt. Gasp went still. Adrian hadn't told anyone about the scraped knuckles except Nora and Miles. The cut had never appeared on the news. Celeste kept talking gently, but Nora no longer heard comfort. She heard surveillance. Adrian looked at her, and the question between them was no longer whether he belonged to another life. He did. The question was why that life was watching him like prey. Nora ended the call. For a long moment the city roared above them. She should have handed him over. She knew that. Every sensible part of her knew that. Instead, she put the phone in her pocket and looked at the man the whole city was searching for. I don't trust you, she said. Adrian nodded as if he accepted that. Nora glanced toward the stairs, where footsteps hurried past in both directions. But I trust them less. And with that, she led him deeper into the subway crowd. They hid in the one place Nora understood better than any police station or penthouse. He saw himself a year earlier, standing in an old building in Queens with dust on his shoes and a hard hat under his arm. Vale Properties bought the block. The tenants were being moved out. The cafes, studios, repair shops, and cheap rehearsal spaces were scheduled to become luxury apartments with a rooftop garden no one from the old neighborhood could afford to enter. He'd hired Nora to paint the final mural on the building's exposed side wall before demolition. A sentimental gesture, he'd called it then. Aesthetic preservation. Now the phrase tasted like cowardice. Nora watched his face. You remember? He nodded slowly. You were painting a woman holding a blue umbrella, he said. But you changed the umbrella into a bird halfway through because a little girl walking by said umbrellas were boring. Nora went still. She'd never told him that. Another memory followed. Weeks of visits, Adrian coming by under the excuse of checking project progress. Nora sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating takeout noodles from the carton, telling him that New York wasn't made of buildings, no matter what men in suits believed. It was made of old shop signs, corner delis, cracked stoops, music leaking from open windows, and the names people carved into wet cement before anyone thought to stop them. He'd listened, at first because she challenged him, then because her way of seeing the city made his own world feel unbearably empty. Nora hadn't known who he was, not fully. He'd said he worked in architecture. He'd said his family was involved in development. He'd never said his family owned the company tearing down the block. He hadn't lied exactly. That was the worst part. He'd given her truths trimmed clean of consequence. Nora's face changed as she understood. You knew me, she said. Adrian closed his eyes. Inhale, yes, and you didn't tell me. I remembered too late, no before. Her voice sharpened. Before the accident, before the tuxedo, before all of this, you knew who I was, and you let me think you were just some architect with sad eyes and too much money. Miles appeared in the bedroom doorway but said nothing. Adrian looked at Nora, and more came back. The bridge. Rain. A night heavy with everything neither of them named. They'd stood beneath the street lamp from her painting, the East River dark below them, the city glittering like it belonged to someone else. Nora's jacket had been too thin for the weather. Adrian wanted to put his coat around her shoulders but had been afraid the gesture'd say too much. He remembered telling her about the wedding, not the whole truth, never the whole truth, only that his family expected it, that Celeste was decent. The marriage made sense in ways love often didn't. Nora'd laughed, but there'd been no humor in it. She'd told him she wouldn't be the little rebellion of a rich man before he went home to marry correctly. She wouldn't be the woman he remembered when his life became too polished to breathe in. If you wanted to leave that wedding, you had to do it because the wedding was wrong, not because I was there. That memory hurt more than the cut on his head, because then came the last one. The night before the wedding, Adrian in a tuxedo soaked in rain, running to the bridge because he needed to see Nora one final time, not to choose her, not bravely, not honestly, to say goodbye. He'd intended to go back to Celeste, to his father's ceremony, to the life already arranged for him. He remembered Nora standing beneath the street lamp, tears in her eyes but her back straight, as if she'd known from the beginning how the story'd end. Then headlights, a horn, his own voice shouting her name, glass, gas, darkness. When Adrian opened his eyes, Nora'd stepped away from him. Her expression was worse than anger. It was recognition. Even before the amnesia, even before Times Square, even before the whole city claimed him, Adrian Vale'd chosen to leave. A knock sounded downstairs. Not the laundromat door, the private entrance. Miles cursed under his breath and moved toward the window. A black car waited at the curb. A man in a dark overcoat stood beneath an umbrella, silver-haired, calm, and perfectly dry despite the rain. Richard Vale didn't need to raise his voice when Nora opened the door. Men like him brought silence with them. He looked past her to Adrian, then around the studio with a faint sadness that felt more insulting than disgust. I'm glad my son is alive, he said, but this has gone far enough. Nora didn't move aside. Richard's gaze settled on her canvas, then the paint-splattered floor, then the cracked ceiling. You should know what he signed, he said. Adrian's face tightened. Richard removed a folded document from his coat and placed it on Nora's work table as if presenting a bill. Vale Properties, redevelopment authorization, tenant relocation schedule, demolition approval. At the bottom was Adrian's signature. Nora read it once, then again. The studio seemed to tilt. Richard's voice remained soft. My son didn't merely belong to the world that's taking yours apart, Miss Ellis. He helped to prove it. Adrian remembered enough to know it was true. Not all the details, not every meeting, but enough. The conference room, the pressured timeline, his father's insistence, his own tired signature because fighting would delay everything and delay, in his world, cost money. Nora looked at him. He could have said he was sorry, sighed he was. But sorry was too small for a wrecking ball. She folded the document with shaking hands and gave it back to Richard without looking at him. Then she turned to Adrian. Get out. Miles whispered her name, but Nora didn't soften. Adrian stood as if the words had physically struck him. Nora. No. Her voice broke, then hardened. You don't get to remember loving me after you helped erase the place I live. He had no answer, so he did the only honest thing left. He left. Richard followed him down the narrow stairs, satisfied without needing to smile. Nora stood in the middle of her studio, surrounded by paint, rain light, and the unfinished bridge where a man had once come to say goodbye. Only now she understood. He'd been saying goodbye long before he lost his memory. Adrian returned to his family because leaving with Richard was the only way to make the storm move away from Nora. By evening, every news channel had changed its headline: Adrian Vale found alive after accident. Vale wedding postponed, not cancelled. Family requests privacy as he recovers. Privacy, Adrian learned quickly, meant a penthouse full of assistants, doctors, lawyers, stylists, and publicists who spoke around him as if his body had been recovered, but his will was still missing. Richard Vale stood near the windows, with Manhattan glittering below him. You embarrassed this family, he said. Adrian sat on the edge of a leather chair, the cut at his temple hidden beneath careful bandaging. I was injured. You were seen with that girl. Her name sat between them, unspoken. Nora. Richard didn't shout. He never needed to. His disappointment had always been more efficient than anger. The press'll forget her if you give them a better story, he said. A concussion, confusion, gratitude for the public's concern. Then the wedding proceeds quietly once doctors clear you. Adrian looked at his father and realized something terrible. Richard wasn't relieved that his son was alive. He was relieved the damage might still be managed. The next morning, Celeste came to see him. She arrived without cameras, without stylists, without the trembling performance she'd given outside the hotel. In private, she wore a plain cream sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face tired in a way magazines would never print. For a while, they stood in the same room like two actors who'd forgotten their lines. Celeste looked at him first. I know about her. Adrian didn't pretend not to understand. Nora, Celeste nodded. Pain moved across her face, but it wasn't Simp's old Izzy. It was older than that, sharper. I knew there was someone before the accident, she said. I didn't know her name. Adrian closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Celeste gave a small, humorless smile. Everyone keeps apologizing to me as if that fixes the fact that my heartbreak has a seating chart. The sentence stunned him. For the first time, Adrian Chen saw her clearly, not as the perfect woman from the screen, but as another person trapped inside the same expensive machine. Celeste Monroe had been raised to be admired, photographed, desired, and never publicly abandoned. Her parents had built her into a symbol. His father had turned their engagement into a merger wrapped in white roses. The press had turned it into a fairy tale. None of them had asked whether love could breathe under all that glass. I did care about you, Celeste said quietly. I know, inhale, but I also cared about winning, about being chosen, about not becoming the woman people whisper about at charity dinners. Adrian looked down at his hands. The bruises across his knuckles had turned purple. I was going to marry you because it made sense. That might be the cruelest thing anyone's ever said to me, she said. He looked up, ashamed. She didn't cry. Somehow, that made the room feel even more fragile. Across the city, Nora packed a suitcase she didn't want to pack. Miles watched from her studio doorway, violin under one arm. So that's it, he asked. Nora folded a sweater too sharply. I need to get out of New York for a while. Because of reporters? Because of everything. Miles leaned against the doorframe. Breathed, no. Because you'd rather leave first than find out if someone else will. Nora stopped. He softened, but didn't take it back. You did it with art school, he said. With people who offered help. With anyone who looked like they might matter. You call it being realistic, but sometimes it just looks like running with better vocabulary. Nora's eyes burned. That man signed away our building. I know. He chose them. I know. And you're defending him? Miles shook his head. I'm defending you from turning one more heartbreak into proof that you were never allowed to want anything. Nora sat down on the edge of the bed. Outside, the city continued without mercy. 2 days later, the wedding proceeded as a media event under a different name. A private family ceremony with security at every entrance and photographers crowded behind barricades. Inhale. The hotel ballroom looked like a dream built by people who'd never slept badly. White orchids hung from glass arches and violins played near the aisle. Guests whispered over crystal champagne flutes while cameras waited beyond the doors. Adrian stood at the front in a black suit. Celeste stood beside him in a gown too beautiful to be kind. Richard watched from the first row, his face unreadable. A minister opened a leather book. Adrian looked at Celeste, breathed. In her eyes he saw not permission exactly, but exhaustion, recognition, maybe even challenge. The minister began. Inhale. Adrian didn't let him finish. He turned toward the guests as a hush moved through the ballroom. He'd spent his entire life speaking in rooms designed to protect power. Boardrooms, galas, press briefings. Carefully lit stages where truth was shaped before it was released. This time his voice shook, but he didn't stop. He said the wedding was never only a wedding. It was an arrangement between families, companies, reputations, and old money. He said Celeste deserved more than to be used as proof that two empires could smile for cameras. He said he'd been too weak, too obedient, and too afraid to admit that before someone got hurt. Celeste closed her eyes. Richard stood. Adrian continued. Vale Properties had hidden the timeline of the Queen's redevelopment. They'd let artists and small tenants believe they had more time while using the wedding coverage to soften public outrage. Adrian had signed the approval. He'd told himself delay would only make things worse, that progress always had casualties, and that his father understood the city better than he did. He said he was wrong. He apologized to Celeste in front of the people who'd come to witness her perfection. Then he apologized to Nora, though she wasn't there, or so he thought. Near the back of the ballroom, half hidden behind a column and a borrowed black coat, Nora stood frozen. Miles had dragged her there with the stubbornness of a younger brother who knew exactly when to stop asking permission. Adrian didn't see her. He only faced the room and said he was stepping down from Vale Properties Board, effective immediately. The silence that followed was almost violent. Then Celeste moved. Slowly she removed her ring. Gasps rippled through the guests. She placed it on the small table beside the altar and looked at Adrian, not lovingly, not forgivingly, but with something like respect. For once, she said, her words clear enough for the front rows to hear, "Thank you for embarrassing me with the truth instead of flattering me with a lie." The ballroom exploded. Reporters surged at the doors. Guests stood. Richard's face went pale with fury. Phones lifted everywhere, recording the collapse of a fairy tale sold to an entire city. Nora stepped back before Adrian could see her. Her heart was pounding, not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. He'd still signed the papers. He'd still hurt her. He'd still chosen wrong before choosing right. But for the first time, Adrian Vale had broken something powerful without knowing whether anyone would love him afterward. And Nora, standing unseen at the edge of the wreckage, realized that maybe this was what truth looked like when it finally arrived too late. Not clean, not painless, but real. After the wedding, Adrian Vale became the kind of story New York loved to tear apart. One week, he'd been the missing groom on every screen in the city. The next, he was the spoiled heir who'd humiliated his father, abandoned his bride, and exposed his own family's company in front of half of Manhattan. Richard Vale removed him from the board within 48 hours. His trust was frozen. His apartment was no longer available for his use, according to an email written by a lawyer who used regret like punctuation. Celeste disappeared from the gossip pages for a month. When she returned, it wasn't as the perfect bride the city had expected to mourn. She launched a small fashion house under her own name, gave one interview without tears, and said she was done being styled into someone else's happy ending. Nora watched all of it from Queens and didn't call Adrian. Not because she didn't care, because caring wasn't the same as trusting. She stayed in New York. She met with tenants, artists, cafe owners, and neighbors who knew the old building not as real estate, but as memory. Adrian didn't offer to buy the building. He didn't arrive with a dramatic check or a promise to fix what his signature had helped break. He knew Nora would have hated that. Instead, he sent architectural notes, old zoning maps, a restoration plan that showed how the building could be converted, strengthened, and kept alive without erasing everyone inside it. He signed nothing. He asked for no credit. The proposal didn't save everything, but it saved enough. A few months later, Nora held a small exhibition in the same building that had almost disappeared. Her paintings showed street musicians, laundromat owners, tired dancers, old men at corner delis, children drawing on sidewalks, the people New York passed every day without really seeing. Adrian came near closing times. No tuxedo, no security, no perfect headline. Just a dark coat, a small bouquet of flowers bought from the corner stand, still wrapped in cheap brown paper. Nora saw him standing by the painting of the bridge. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she asked, "Are you still lost?" Adrian looked at the painting, then at her. "Yes," he said. "But this time I'm not trying to find my way back to the old house." Nora studied him longer than she meant to. The anger was still there, so was the hurt. But beneath it was something quieter, the fragile respect you feel for someone who stopped asking forgiveness to be convenient. Finally, she took the flowers. Inhale. Then walk with me, she said. New York makes more sense when you're not looking at it from above. They stepped outside together. The city screens no longer showed Adrian's face. They flashed perfume ads, stock updates, Broadway posters, and news no one stopped long enough to read. New York had moved on, because cities always did. But for Nora, something changed. The man who'd once belonged to every screen was now beside her on the sidewalk, asking for nothing immediate. Not trust, not absolution, not her hand, just the chance to keep walking without disappearing. If I were Nora Ellis, I think I would have been terrified to trust Adrian again. Not because he was rich, not because his face had been on every screen in the city, but because he'd already chosen the world he came from once. He'd chosen duty, family pressure, reputation, and a future arranged for him by people who measured love like a business deal. So let me ask you, if you were Nora, would you've walked away from Adrian forever, or would you've given him time to prove he'd truly changed? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you would have chosen. And if this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe Soul-Stirring Stories. Until next time, remember, love isn't always the person who chooses you first. Sometimes love is the person who chose wrong, lost the easy road, and came back not asking to be forgiven, but willing to become worthy, even if you never reach for their hand.